So I wanted to start out with a little bit of information about my team. Many of you may know me from my work at CMS, but I'm not sure if everybody is as familiar with our team, which is a relatively new team at CMS, the Health Informatics and Interoperability Group. Our mission is to promote the secure exchange, access, and use of electronic health information to support better informed decision-making and a more efficient healthcare system. And in practical terms, what that really means is that my team works across CMS to identify opportunities for the use of standards, to streamline and enhance the existing systems and programs that we already have, and also to stand up new systems that support interoperable data exchange. You all may know some of our work from our interoperability rule, the CMS Interoperability and Patient Access Final Rule, which was finalized in May of 2020. All of the policies in this rule have been finalized and implemented, so I'm not going to walk through any of those today. But as you'll see, there's an arrow on this map that says "You are here," and it points well off the map. And that is because we've already made great progress from this first interoperability rule. I remember when we released this rule, or when we finalized it, I heard a presentation where someone called this rule transformational because it was the first time that we were engaging health plan payers in the interoperability space and putting actual interoperability requirements on the payers. And in just this short couple of years, we've already gone beyond that. We've made much more progress beyond just engaging payers in the interoperability space and really starting to transform healthcare in other ways through the use of standards. So that's a little bit of what I want to talk about today. And when I was preparing for this presentation, I asked the folks here today that are hosting you all, what they wanted me to cover, and they said I could cover whatever I wanted. So first of all, that was dangerous because I am going to talk about a lot of different things. But secondly, it really gives me the opportunity to draw to some of these connections and to talk about how far we've come from just that first rule that, again, just 2 years ago, folks were calling transformational, but we've gone beyond that. And we're on this roadmap to interoperability. So you guys have probably seen this slide before. If you've ever heard a presentation that me or anyone on my team has given, I think we all use this slide as a background to talk about our path to interoperability and to talk about this journey that we're all on together in getting towards interoperability and CMS's commitment in helping to lead the way. So throughout the rest of my presentation today, I want to talk about some of the regulations and guidance and even some of the RFIs that we've put out. So really the policy side of things that we're doing that help us show that we have a future direction on this path and that we're looking for input from stakeholders in industry such as yourselves to help shape that path forward. CMS does a whole lot of work in this space. So I should say that there's a lot of work I'm not going to be talking about today. And selfishly, I'm going to be focusing on just my own work and the work that my team does in collaboration with folks across the agency. But there's also a lot of other things going on that I won't have time to cover today. For example, we have a great team in our Centers for Clinical Standards and Quality that's working on FHIR-enabling digital quality measures to streamline the digital quality measurement programs. We also have a wonderful team in our own IT department at CMS that's working on FHIR-enabling some of CMS's own data exchange. And there's a lot of great work happening there. But today, again, I'm going to focus on the policy work that my team has been doing in collaboration with the other areas around CMS to bring those policies to the public and to get public feedback on the work that we're pursuing on this path to interoperability. So the first one I wanted to talk about is an RFI that you all may have seen. We recently released, and the comment period actually just closed last week, on an RFI for a national directory of healthcare. Again, the comment period is closed, but I just wanted to briefly talk about this because it's one way that we're trying to get industry feedback on a very early concept that we're considering to support interoperability. We have heard over and over again that there are significant challenges to interoperability due to a lack of accurate data directories and a lack of a directory for digital endpoint data. That while there are directories of digital endpoint data, we find that they're not always as complete as needed to support the interoperable data exchange that exists in some of our policies. So we issued this RFI to seek comment about going beyond the traditional provider directory concept and going into something that would include the other entities in healthcare, including payers and other services. And when I talk about services, I mean including things like public health entities and providers at post-acute or long-term care facilities. This RFI was really open to receiving any feedback from industry on what a national directory could look like and what a centralized data hub for directory and digital contact information should look like, and what should CMS's role be in supporting that. Throughout the RFI, we highlighted the use of FHIR as a standard to support the directory data exchange that would be necessary for such a large directory, and would help to bring some of this some interoperability and interoperable data exchange to what was historically siloed directory information. So while we're still processing the comments that we received last week, there's a lot to unpack here in terms of the use of standards and the use of directory to support standards-enabled data exchange. Now, like I promised you, I'm going to give you a little bit of whiplash because I'm completely changing gears, and I debated whether or not to even include this RFI, but I think it's really important to demonstrate the breadth and scope of interoperability work at CMS. This is another RFI that my team helped to develop, and in this RFI, we stepped away from some of the clinical aspects of data and the traditional healthcare purposes of that data exchange to examine how a FHIR standard could support price transparency efforts coming out of the No Surprises Act. So we sought comment on many elements of the advanced explanation of benefits and good faith estimate requirements of the No Surprises Act, but in particular, we asked about the use of FHIR for this purpose and what role should or could FHIR play in exchanging that data and making it consumer friendly and end user easy to understand. I hope that already you're starting to see the standards theme in the way that we incorporate standards into all of our policy and guidance and RFI, and the way that we're thinking about that path towards interoperability. Then most recently, also last Tuesday, when the comment period for the National Directory closed, we started a new chapter by publishing a new proposed rule with a short title, Advancing Interoperability and Improving Prior Authorization Processes. The comment period for this rule should actually open today, and it will run through March 13th. So it's a 90-day comment period. You all are likely familiar with our previous two interoperability rules. There was the CMS Interoperability and Patient Access Rule that was published in May of 2020, and that's the timeline that I showed just a moment ago. And that was, again, the first time that we engaged payers in the interoperability space. But then in December of 2020, we published another proposed rule that focused on interoperability and prior authorization. With this proposed rule, now advancing interoperability and improving prior authorization processes, we are actually withdrawing that previous rule and replacing it with this one. So you may note that a lot of the proposed policies are very similar. And in some cases, they're exactly identical to those that were in the 2020 proposed rule. But these have been enhanced or modified based on the feedback that we received from that previous proposed rule, as well as advancements that have taken place over the last 2 years. So if you've ever wondered how CMS takes the public comments and incorporates them into our rules and or takes comments on RFIs and turns them into policy, I think this rule is a pretty good example of how we've done that. This newly proposed rule demonstrates our continued commitment to interoperability and also to reducing burden in healthcare. The rule puts a focus on prior authorization, which has historically been a significant source of provider burden, as well as payer burden. We always talk about this as provider burden, but we also understand that there's a considerable administrative lift for the payers that implement these prior authorizations as well. And with this proposed rule, we're attempting to streamline that prior authorization process to save time for clinicians and for payers so they can put that time back into taking care of patients. I'm going to dig a little bit more into these rule policies, and I'll break them up in 3 parts. There are policies for payers, there are policies for providers, and then there's a section also on interoperability standards. And then there are also some RFIs, which we'll go over briefly. So very quickly, I want to go through the policies for the payers. Well, not very quickly, there are quite a few policies, but proposals for the payers that were in this proposed rule. And when we talk about the payers impacted, that includes Medicare Advantage organizations, which is one of the significant changes between this rule and the rule that was previously proposed with prior authorization policies. That previous rule did not include Medicare Advantage plans, but we chose to include them in this rule directly because of the overwhelming public comment asking us to do so. So that includes Medicare Advantage organizations, state and Medicaid fee-for-service agencies, Medicaid and CHIP managed care plans, and qualified health plans on the federally facilitated exchanges. All of these payers would be impacted by the policies in this proposed rule, and that is almost all of the payers that CMS regulates. The first policy that we proposed was a patient access API. Now, we've already finalized a patient access API in our first interoperability rule, but in this rule, we're proposing to add prior authorization data to that patient access API, bringing better transparency to the prior authorization process for patients. Secondly, we're proposing a provider access API that would provide the same data that's delivered to patients in the patient access API in yet another FHIR-enabled API format that would be delivered to providers who have an established relationship with a patient. So just in this way, we're allowing providers access to the same information that the patients are seeing in their API and really enabling a better conversation where both entities are looking at the same data from the health plan payer. Then the next policy that we proposed for payers was a payer-to-payer data exchange. And this is a policy we've been working on for a long time. So those of you familiar with our work know that we had previously finalized a policy for payer-to-payer data exchange, but we didn't require a specific mechanism or any sort of standard for sharing that data. And we learned our lesson. We heard from payers that it would be near impossible to implement this in a way that would promote the right data exchange and the type of data exchange that we wanted to see to better enable patient data sharing and payer-to-payer information sharing. So we are rescinding that previously finalized policy and replacing it with a policy that would require payers to share the data using a FHIR-based API. You're probably already tired of me saying FHIR-based API, but that's very much the theme throughout this proposed rule and in a lot of the policies that we've put out recently. Then one more. So we call this rule the improving prior authorization processes proposed rule, because we have not only proposed to require that payers share that data with patients, providers, and other payers, but because we're actually modernizing the prior authorization process itself by proposing to require that impacted payers would build an API that would allow clinicians to, through their own practice management systems, their own EHR systems, to query whether a prior authorization is required for a particular item or service. If it is required, to determine what type of data and documentation are needed, and to actually facilitate the process of submitting a prior authorization request itself, all electronically through this FHIR-based API. This is one that I believe is truly transformational for the prior authorization process. This is one that's going to get us more towards will not directly automate prior authorization decisions, but it could automate the prior authorization process, saving everyone time in that process. So this is a critically important piece of this proposed rule. We're also proposing a couple of other policies around prior authorization that are not technical in nature. For example, we're proposing to require that if a payer denies a prior authorization, that they would provide a reason for that denial, regardless of how the prior authorization is submitted. If it's submitted through the API, that reason could go through the API, but if it's submitted through another mechanism, the payer would still need to provide that reason for denial, again, regardless of the mechanism used to submit the prior authorization request. The next non-technical proposal that we have is proposing to standardize the prior authorization decision timeframes. We're proposing that decisions would need to be made within 72 hours for expedited requests and 7 days for non-urgent or standard requests. We're also seeking comment on shorter timeframes for those prior authorization decision timeframes. So lots of interesting comments to be read there, I'm sure. And then finally, we're trying to bring even more transparency to the prior authorization process by proposing that payers would publish their prior authorization metrics on their websites. So reporting the number of prior authorizations they've approved or denied, or how many denials get overturned on appeal. All of that information would be available, again, on the payer's own website for patients and providers together to see that information. Now, switching gears, still talking about the same rule, but talking about the proposals that would impact providers. And these proposals would impact the eligible hospitals and critical access hospitals, as well as eligible clinicians under the Promoting Interoperability programs. So in order to ensure that providers are actually using these APIs that we propose for payers to build for prior authorization, we're proposing this measure under the Promoting Interoperability programs that would require those impacted payers to report on the number of unique prior authorizations that are requested from the prior authorization API using data from their certified EHR technology. This is yet another one of those policies that is a direct response to public comment in which commenters were concerned that payers would be building these APIs and no one would use them. Well, this proposal for providers would help to ensure that we're really rounding out that prior authorization process and ensuring that payers and providers alike are utilizing these APIs to really streamline this process and improve the historically burdensome process of prior authorization. On the next couple of slides, I have, I'm just going to reference on the screen. We have, because our work is so focused on the standards of interoperability, we have proposed to require certain standards to build the APIs that are included in this rule. And those that are required are shown on your screen. These are standards that were previously adopted by the Office of the National Coordinator, or ONC. And so these are already in federal regulation, and we are adopting them for the purposes of our policies and requiring them for these APIs. And this is a list of the recommended implementation guides to support the APIs. Now, it's important to note that we are not proposing to require these implementation guides, though we do talk about potentially requiring them in the future. At this point, they are only strongly recommended, but I do mean very strongly recommended. And we hope that by using these implementation guides, we will drive these APIs towards better interoperability through consistent implementation. So it's very important that everyone who plans to comment on the policies also review these implementation guides. I'm not going to read through each of the requests for information or go through all of them because I'm probably already limited on my time here, but I just wanted to highlight that we did include several RFIs, all of which are related to the use of technology and interoperable standards to support innovation and better data sharing in healthcare. So while these topics range greatly in their focus areas, all of it comes back to that concept of technology supporting better data exchange and an improved healthcare system. So I encourage you to review these and comment if you're able to during that 90-day comment period. We gave you lots of time to comment. So if you want to comment, this is your chance. So, so please note that each of these touches on a critically important area. And again, they all link back to that use of standards and for information sharing and interoperability in healthcare. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more on this last slide about CMS's commitment to interoperability. If it's not clear from my message so far, I want to reiterate that CMS is committed to interoperability, and we will continue to drive innovation and change in healthcare to introduce policies and efficiencies, or policies that drive efficiencies wherever we see opportunities to do so. We have a proven track record of developing regulation to support interoperability as well as supporting innovation. And we at CMS, and particularly in my team, I love to brag about my team, and so I'm going to keep doing that. But across CMS, and particularly with the folks that I work with, we take a hands-on approach when it comes to supporting innovation, refining implementation guides, and leading by example by supporting folks out there in industry. In fact, if you aren't aware, CMS directly supports numerous standards organizations. We work very closely with the Da Vinci Project, the Karen Alliance, the FAST Initiative, and the Gravity Project to advance the use of FHIR APIs and drive implementation for the policies that you've heard about here today. So I hope it is clear from this presentation and from our proposed rule and the previous proposed rules and RFIs that the use of standards, and particularly the FHIR standards to support APIs, is the way of the future and the direction that we're going. We are also considering, in addition, so sorry, in summary, I should say, we have proposed or finalized a litany of APIs here: patient access, provider access, payer-to-payer, prior authorizations. We've talked about how APIs can support a national directory. We've even talked about how APIs can support price transparency. So the natural question you may be asking is, why is she still talking about this? And what is next for all of this work? And so some of that is going to be shaped by you, by the comments that you provide to our rule, as well as the feedback that we receive on the RFIs that we've issued, both the independent RFIs and the ones that are attached to the proposed rule. Your feedback is literally what is shaping our path to interoperability. One of the RFIs that I want to highlight, and perhaps this is a good transition because I understand that Mickey is going to be presenting right after me, but one of the RFIs that is included in the proposed rule is related to how TEFCA can support CMS programs. And I understand that you all will be talking about TEFCA throughout the rest of your day, so I wanted to tie this in a little bit to the rest of your conversations. As you all know, the TEFCA Common Agreement and Technical Framework were released to the public in January of this year. And as I understand from Mickey, we are very excited to know that 10 organizations have submitted letters of intent to become QHINs. So for the rest of today, I would really love for you to think about the role that TEFCA can play in supporting the APIs that I've talked about here today. All of the APIs, from those included in the rule to those that might support a potential national directory, or ways that it can support price transparency. I think that the underlying concept and common agreement of TEFCA can really support these policies in unique and different ways, and would love to hear some of your feedback on that. We all have been working on, I think, TEFCA as well as interoperability for a very long time. And this is very exciting work. And we hope that CMS and ONC can work together to find ways that this work can support our efforts to increase data sharing in healthcare. So we at CMS, I know I in particular, I'll speak for myself and also speak on behalf of my team. I know we're looking forward to reading your feedback from the proposed rule, to hearing your feedback about what you learned today and how you think that TEFCA can support the policies we've talked about. And then we'll continue reading your comments and seeking your feedback on various topics so that you can help us shape that path forward in the direction that we're going in. I've included a slide of helpful resources, which we're happy to share. A lot of this is links to some of the standards that we've talked about, as well as the implementation guides. And then I wouldn't be complete here today if I didn't include a shameless plug asking you to comment on the proposed rule and comment and noting the comment deadline, which is as of now, March 13th, so 90 days from now. So thank you very much for allowing me to present today. Thank you for accommodating me on Zoom as well. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person. I'd be happy to take any of your questions if folks have any questions in the audience.
Right. Great, Alex. Thank you very much for being here and presenting to us. A lot of great information. And I expect that we'll have a lot of feedback from the group. So we are going to take some questions, and hopefully, Alex, can you hear me all right? Okay, yes. Perfect. So you should be able to hear the microphones in the room. So we've got some mic runners, and we've got a few minutes to let people ask questions. I see Stephen Lane up front, anxiously waving his arm to ask the first question, and I'll be up here in case anything doesn't come through or needs to be restated, but hopefully you can hear the microphones as they move around. So let's start up here with Stephen.
Two mics are coming. Hey, Alex, how are you? Stephen Lane. I really appreciate your presentation and all of your and your team's enthusiasm for supporting and promoting interoperability. I think, obviously, if you were here in the room, we'd all be giving you high fives and hugs, so thank you for that. So I've got a couple of questions, but I'll sort of dole them out slowly. The first one is you were just talking about TEFCA and CMS's support for TEFCA. And obviously, you guys have gone on record through the 2023 Promoting Interoperability incentives to trying to modestly support TEFCA Exchange, which I think is great. I don't know that it's going to really move the needle very far because it's hard to picture providers, or hospitals that aren't meeting the measure today that will be able to more easily meet it by joining TEFCA next year. But I guess I'm really interested in where we go next. What else does CMS have planned, or what are you thinking about as additional ways to incentivize TEFCA Exchange? Because I think a lot of people share my opinion that it's really going to be strong incentives that are going to bring people on to the new framework as it evolves. And I think CMS is really in one of the best positions of anyone across our industry to incentivize that use.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And if Mickey's there, I'm sure he's jumping in to try to answer some of this as well. But I think, I would agree that I think that a strong CMS ONC partnership will help to promote and incentivize engagement with the TEFCA. And that is a lot of what we're seeking comment on through the RFI as well as, what I would love for you all to think about here today. So I think that there are a lot of opportunities and things that we're discussing internally, nothing that we can necessarily share at this point, but there are a lot of opportunities and things that we're thinking about and would love to work with ONC on. But it really helps to hear your feedback to help us shape that path forward for TEFCA. And I appreciate your feedback on the promoting interoperability programs and your thoughts on that piece. I think that that's one small piece of what we could look at overall. And there's a lot, particularly with the APIs that we've proposed here, that if finalized, could lead to a lot of a good promising direction for TEFCA going forward.
Great, thank you. I see we've got another question here in the back.
Right. Hey, Alex, my name is Bill Howard. I had a question about the consent and all these APIs. There's even in the most recent prior auth that talked about almost like an opt-out type of a model, but the previous APIs talked about or hinted at sort of an opt-in model or a patient consent or an authorization or something. Could you comment on that a little bit and just kind of share kind of what you see as being required around patient consent or authorization to get access to the data?
Yeah, absolutely. I should start answering that question by saying that, ensuring that patients know what's happening with their data and that they have, that we all consider the utmost privacy and security considerations for sharing patient data. That is really the foundation of a lot of these APIs, and that's actually built into some of the APIs and the standards themselves. But specifically on the consent piece, so I'm just going to go through each of the APIs real quickly. For patient access, a patient would have to opt in because they would be asking the app of their choosing to access their data through their payer. So in that sense, patient access API is absolutely an opt-in for the patients. Then on the provider access piece, that is actually, we are proposing that as an opt-out. And the reason being that we already know that providers and payers are exchanging certain patient data and that they should have the ability to, providers are often sending quite a bit of patient data to payers. We want to see that data coming back to the provider and ensuring that everyone's getting a complete picture of that patient to provide the best possible care. So if a provider has an established care relationship with the patient and they request that data from the payer, that is an opt-out. The patient would have to opt out of that data sharing, and otherwise the payer and the provider will collaborate on that data sharing for that particular API. For payer-to-payer, we did make that one an opt-in for several reasons, but really what it comes down to is payers are going to need a way to get the previous payer's information from the patient. So they're already going to be asking for that. In addition, there were some considerations around Medicaid patients and consent requirements for Medicaid patients. So payer-to-payer, long story short, is an opt-in for patients. We anticipate that payers will work with their enrollees to try to encourage the opt-in and to get that information so that they can enjoy the benefits of that data sharing. And then for prior authorization, that's an administrative process. It is not, there is no consent restrictions around that. And we do actually talk about in the rule why those same consent considerations that fell, that impacted the payer-to-payer decision to be opt-in, why those don't apply in the prior authorization context. So happy to provide more detail on that or pull it out of the rule. It is discussed at length in the rule. And I understand it can be a little confusing that each of the APIs has a different consent mechanism, but ultimately it all gets at that data sharing in the best possible way for the patient.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for one, maybe two more questions. I see Stephen's ready to go again up front.
See, Alex, you should have just come and joined us in person. It would have been great.
I wish I could have.
Yeah. So another question I have. So in the recent interop and prior auth NPRM, I mean, when I looked at it, I was struck by the long 3-year proposed timeline for compliance. I mean, that's a really long time in our world, right? Why 3 years instead of 2 or 2.5? Or, I mean, it seems so long. And then the other question, I'll double up on you, is obviously you did a great job identifying all of the different implementation guides that are out there to support these API implementations. but none of them were required. None of them were specifically required, which seems like a missed opportunity, especially in light of such a long timeline, you know, when people have time to actually build this stuff. So I'm curious, why the long delay, and why not name the IGs?
So I just gotta say, first of all, y'all crack me up, because if we had proposed 2 years, I swear that someone would come back and fighting us and say, how can we do this in 2 years? 2 years is not enough time. And then we say 3 years and everybody says, why so long? Which I totally understand. And I really, really, really appreciate. I think you and I, it sounds like, think alike, and I would always like to move things along faster, especially as it gets us on our path to interoperability. However, in the December 2020 interoperability proposed rule, the one that was never finalized, it's like the rule that shall not be named. That rule was, you know, we had certain timeframes in there, and we heard overwhelmingly that payers needed more time. In part, there were a couple of reasons. Folks were still coming off of the implementation of Rule 1 with the patient access and provider directory APIs. And also we were in the midst of COVID. And so I think for a lot of folks, they were looking at this saying, we need more time. We've gotten farther away from that. And so, yes, I think we could have proposed quicker timeframes, but we also wanted to ensure that we were giving adequate time for those that are recovering from, you know, for example, the Medicaid unwinding and the other considerations coming out of COVID. We want to ensure, you know, that these policies have time to be implemented correctly. These are really critically important policies, and unlike, you know, patient access or provider directory, if those had a delayed start, that would be one thing, because you can tell patient, you can communicate with patients and tell them to wait, or you can put up a notice saying that the provider directory is coming. With prior authorization, we're talking about an entire administrative process that on both ends of the spectrum, both on the payer side and on the provider side, has to be implemented correctly in order for this to be launched in a successful way and ensure that we get adequate adoption. If we launch these APIs and they don't work, or there's a missing connection there, we're going to see a lot of frustration and maybe a lack of adoption among providers in really integrating these APIs into their workflows. We don't want that to happen. We want to give everyone time to implement correctly, for payers to convert all of their prior authorization requirements into this FHIR framework, and then ensure that when it is launched, it is done so correctly. And I will just say, you know, from the Medicare fee-for-service perspective, we're also implementing these requirements, and we know how hard it can be to move your prior auth. We have like less than 10 prior authorizations, but it's going to take us time to clean up our requirements and get them into this electronic format to be able to be FHIR enabled. And so for those payers out there that have thousands of prior authorizations, we know it's going to take them time as well. And again, we want to ensure that it's done right. So I think that 3-year implementation timeframe is reasonable. I would love to move it up too, though, so I can't disagree with you. But thank you for the question.
Great, thank you. And unless we have anyone holding a microphone, do we have somebody with a mic over here? Go ahead, last question.
Okay. And I didn't answer the second part of the previous question, so I will do both if that's okay.
Yes.
Very briefly, can you speak to the prior authorization metrics that you're requiring the payers to publish on their websites? Can you speak to what you anticipate what's the point? What's supposed to come out of the other end of that? And is that something that will gain in future dates? Will CMS be looking at enhancing those and turning them into like performance measures?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And thanks for the chance to clarify that. So for the metrics, as I mentioned, it's things like, you know, the approvals and the denials and denials that are overturned on appeal and things of that nature. And that data would be shared on the payer website. So CMS won't be collecting it now, and it would not be a performance metric now. However, I will say that is something that we've considered for the future. Is there a metric to be looked at here for payers? But the point is to provide that better transparency, to allow patients to look at this and say, well, if I think I'm going to need a prior authorization and I go with this payer, you know, this is what their metrics are. This is what that might mean for me. It's also an opportunity for providers to look at the payers that they contract with and have a conversation with them to say, You know, I do a lot of prior authorizations in my work. Is this going to be a challenge for me? And it's not going to be a clear picture. You know, this data is not like a really clear, this is how people are going to make a decision about the path forward and who to work with or whatnot. But it is providing more transparency, and it gives payers something to strive for too, to improve those metrics and try to ensure that they're making those decisions within the prior authorization timeframes that we've proposed and whatever ultimately gets finalized. So it's a marker. It's something.
And with that, I'm going to turn a few minutes now over to Mickey,
to track our own progress
in the
towards
room
meeting these
somewhere.
metrics and ensuring that we're
coming up on the side, the National
timely
Coordinator
and
of the
appropriate
Office of the
care
National
to
Coordinator for Health
to
Information
our
Technology,
beneficiaries.
Mickey Tripathi.
So if you have thoughts on those metrics, we'd love to hear more. Definitely submit a comment because that's. I think that's one where there's a lot of future potential too. So we'd like to hear what folks are thinking about there.
It's great to be here.
And if it's all right, I will go back to, I believe was the question about
it's really
implementation
particularly
guidance,
particularly delight to be here because all of you are the ringers
So
of
in the previous
network
proposal rule, we did
interoperability and
propose to
health
require
information
the
exchange. So
IGs,
really,
and in this one we did
really
not.
want to
And there were a couple reasons.
engage all of
and
you
one of them
and
is
where we are
specifically
and the
that
magic of the
farther
moment
out
that we're in
time
right
frame.
now.
The rule's not going to go.
First off, I
these policies
do
won't
want to
be
give
implemented
a
until
tremendous
2026.
amount of credit
between
and
now and
kudos to
then, some
Alex
of these
Mugby. One of the
IGs,
delights
particularly as folks
of
are
taking this job a
implementing
year and a half,
further
almost 2 years
testing
ago.
may
It's gone very
have
fast.
occasional
Is
changes
the
and
opportunity to
updates.
be able
And
to
one of
work
the challenges that
with
we
folks
have
like
in
Alex,
regulating technology,
federal
is that
career
we,
folks who are
when we
so
put something
committed and
into
so incredibly
regulation,
knowledgeable,
we have to say,
as you
we're
saw, and really
adopting
entrepreneurial
XYZ
in the ways they think about helping
version
to have the
1.1.
regulatory impetus
If there's a
to be
version
able to help the market
1.3
innovate
that comes
and
out
to keep
before the
moving
rule
forward.
is finalized,
that's
we
just
can't
been a
update
delightful
that.
part of
We
the
are
job is working
finalizing
with
that
Alex and the
particular
team at
version.
CMS as
And
well
what
as
we
the other
don't
federal
want to
partners
do
we'll
right
talk
now
about in a
is
second.
stifle innovation
As
in
we
this
think
area.
about interoperability, as kind of reflect on,
additional,
I've been in this now for 21
there's some
years,
additional
something
work
like
that's
that.
going to be happening
Started
in
in
this
Health
time
IT
frame.
in Indianapolis,
And all of these IGs are very
Mark
stable
Overhage
and I
Clem
believe
McDonald
fully
and
ready
folks
for
out with the
implementation.
Regency
But if there are
Institute
additional
to
changes,
help
we
to
don't want
found
to
and
stifle
launch
that
the
innovation. We don't want to lock
Indiana Health
anyone into
Information
a
Exchange.
previous version
And I
because
think
there are
back
breaking changes.
on
Now,
what we were doing
the
back
side
then
with
and
the
the things that
ONC
we would have
standards,
loved
ONC
to have been
has
able to
established
have.
a process for their
Back then you may
standard
recall this
whereby
like
there's a standards
2001,
advancement
2002.
process.
So the HIPAA
So folks can
privacy and
use,
security
and
rules
by the way,
were
CMS
just
has adopted that same,
were just being
the
released
same
and modified in those
process
early days
for
as well. So
the
that was
standards
just
we
very
require.
fresh to the market.
But it
and very
allows
fresh in
people
all of
to
our
use
understandings.
a newer
No one had
version of the
EHRs,
standard,
of course. Right? We were trying to build phone networks and
as
no one
long
had
as they're
phones.
maintaining the
So that was a little part of the
requirements
challenge.
of the rule.
There was no
ONC and
high
CMS implemented it a
capacity,
little bit
high
differently,
speed,
but that's
high
how
bandwidth
CMS implemented
commodity
it.
internet.
And for that,
So
for
Clem
those
and
works,
Mark
we're
were
not
literally
stifling
laying
innovation.
down
We're allowing people
T1,
to use more
T3
advanced
lines
version
all
of the
across the
standard,
city to connect
while
up these
ensuring that
hospitals
there's
to be able to get
quote,
the kind of data
backwards
that they were able to
compatibility
get
or
into
that
the
we're not breaking any of the requirements.
Registry system.
With some of these IGs,
And
we
we
didn't
didn't
have the
really
ability to do
have
that same
anything to
advancement
point
process
to
as of
above
yet.
us.
It's
As we were
something that
thinking
we're
about
working on, and that's
interoperability
why
and
I
the things
say
we were
that we are
building, it's
looking
like,
at
well, it'd be
proposing
great to be able
require
to
these
point to
IGs in
something
the
else, to be
future.
able to say
But at this
what
point in
is going to
time,
connect us up
we
to
as
everything else.
policy
Here we are
regulators,
just
we
trying to
weren't
figure
ready.
stuff out, in our market here. But it would be really
I hope
helpful
that
to have a
answers
North
the
Star,
question. If you have
to be able to know where is all this
follow-up
stuff
questions,
headed,
I'd love to talk to you about
and that we don't have to
Yeah,
figure
that
it all
sounded
out by
great.
ourselves.
Alex, thank you so
that
much
there are going to be
for
others,
making the time to be with us here today.
That interoperability might extend beyond kind of geography to other sorts of affiliations.
And
of
I'm
course, back
sure
at the
you'll get
time,
many
as,
comments from
all
the
of you,
folks in
or
this
many
group,
or
and
most
we'll
of you
look
may
forward
recall, we
to
were thinking
future
very much at the
engagement
time of
in moving things
interoperability,
forward
nationwide
with
interoperability,
CMS's
being
involvement
this
in
kind of
leading interoperability.
geographically connecting up
Thank
the
you.
geographic kind of health information exchanges. So we started in in Indianapolis and Rhode Island, a number of places, and then me